Up first, data binding. Blazor comes with support for data binding, making it easy for us to expose, for example, a string property and declaratively bind to that property in the markup code. Without knowing it really, you have already, in the previous module, used data binding when you created the detail screen of the employee. Now, Blazor actually has different options for data binding. We can do one-way data binding, two-way data binding, and bind to a component parameter. The one-way data binding, as the name implies, indicates that data flows in one direction, meaning that updates to the value will happen in just one single way. In the snippet you see here on the slide, we are displaying the value of the first name and the last name properties. We're using data binding here, and we're using for that the add symbol. This indicates that the value should be retrieved dynamically. If the value of the first name or last name changes, for example by a user interaction such as clicking on a button, the UI will also be updated. In Blazor, executing event handlers, such as clicking a button, will automatically re-render the UI. We don't need to specifically ask for that in code. Using a data binding makes sense when we want this link to exist between the source and the target. You've seen already that in the HTML code, we can use also the dot notation, for example, to bind the employee dot first name, thereby requiring that employee is available to bind to. It's also possible to use this syntax for data binding inside of a form control, such as an input. Here we are setting the value of the input again to the first name property of employee. Now be careful though. Although this is now an input, changing the value in the UI won't have any effect on the source, so the employee instance. Real data binding, where we can let the user enter data and capture that entered data, will require the use of the add-bind directive, specified on the input component. It will specify to what we are binding to. This can be a property, a field, or even a razor expression. We'll see that in action in just a minute. Using data binding will typically happen in combination with a form. You are probably familiar with an HTML form. Well, of course, Blazor relies on this entirely. Using the form, we can allow users to enter information such as the details for a new employee. The information entered by the user will then typically be sent to the backend. So what we'll do is use the methods defined on our API to create or edit an employee. Inside the form, we can use the, let's say, default HTML form components, such as input equals text. While these work, Blazor comes with a set of input components which are more optimal to work with. They support out-of-the-box validation features, and we'll see those later in this module too. When we create our form in the next topic, I will use these Blazor components. But for now, let's use the HTML ones first. Here we can see data binding in a regular HTML form control at work. I've used a regular HTML input, but then notice I've used the add bind, and its value is set to the property I'm binding to, the last name property of the employee, which is probably again a property defined in the component class. By writing this add bind here, I'm binding in a two-way mode this component with the value. So if a value is set on the initialization of the component, we'll see this value. But if the user now makes a change, the value will also be updated. The default behavior will be that the value will get updated when the user taps out of the input. The latter we can also influence. If we, for example, want to update the value while the user is typing, we can add the bind value : event and specify the event we want to trigger the data binding on. The result of the code you see here is that every time the user will type a character, the property value will be updated.